Hello there. Welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this month's episode of Christmas on the 25th, where I take you along while I start my Christmas card stash. So get comfy and let's get crafty. First thing I did was take one sheet of red cardstock and cut it into half to create a top folding A2 style, portrait style card. And then the second half I cut into two pieces. One is I'm going to be stamping the ornaments on it, and the other one is cut down to 4 by 5 1/4. And we're going to start with this piece of paper first because I need it to dry. I pulled out a dark red ink, and I am going to be doing some ink blending on the edge of the card. I just feel like this adds a little bit of shadow, and I just have been liking it lately. I know I've done it a lot, but I've been liking it lately. So I'm just adding some ink to this panel, leaving the center a little bit lighter, blending it out, and then we're going to stamp. So I have selected 3 of the ornament stamps from that stamp set. It is probably the first Christmas stamp set that I purchased with coordinating dies. It might be the first stamp set I purchased that had coordinating dies. So this is a true shop your stash Christmas card. I am going to ink them up with Versamark ink. I have prepared that piece of cardstock with an anti-static powder tool so that I can do some heat embossing and have the embossing powder only stick to the areas that have been stamped. I am going to stamp these images twice because there is a lot of detail and it seemed like I was missing some of it the first time around. So I inked the stamps up again, and this time I am really mushing that ink pad into the red rubber of the stamps. Now, back in the day when I first started stamping, red rubber stamps were all there were if you wanted good quality. And a good portion of the stamps that I have kept that are seasonal like this are red rubber stamps. And it's because you get really good quality with them. They're not as easy to line up. They're not as easy to do coordinating things with, but you get really good images. So once I have inked them up and I like how they are working, I did need a little more pressure on some of them in some places, I'm going to add the embossing powder. Now I tried this the first time with white embossing powder on that red cardstock, that's what I'm looking for, and I didn't love it. And I did some experimenting and just didn't love it. So I decided to start over, and I just flipped that panel over because there's white on the back of that. See, you're going to see right there. See, it's there. And I decided to do the heat embossing in silver, and I liked that a lot more. I think that the shiny of the silver kind of gave it just a little step up. Now I am removing some of the silver embossing powder with a dry paintbrush. Because I have been handling this piece of paper, there are still some oils from my fingers on the cardstock. When I put the embossing powder on, I like to leave it sitting flat for just a minute and let that embossing powder really be grabbed by that ink. And I leave it that way for a second or two before or maybe 10, I don't know, I've never actually counted, before I tip it off. And I can just put all of this embossing powder on that white paper back into that tub. You've seen me do it about a dozen times, I'm sure. And it's all ready to use again. It's like very little waste here. So now I'm going to speed through the heat setting of this silver embossing powder. And they're so shiny and pretty, and I love them. Once that has dried, though, and do not do this until the embossing powder has cooled off. Take a dry cloth and just rub it over the cardstock, and all of that extra anti-static powder will come off the cardstock, and you'll have that bright red or whatever color cardstock again. So I'm just cleaning that all up, and it's time to die cut these images. So I do have the coordinating dies, like I said, and I'm just going to line them up on the cardstock. I'm going to tape them down with some washi tape, run them through my die cut machine, and by the magic of editing, you didn't have to sit and wait for all that to be done. Now I have a layout in mind, kind of similar to how I stamp them. I want to have a group of 3, 2 on the left, 1 on the right, but I also need them to not be floating in midair, right? I mean, because that's not spooky or weird or anything. So I have another stamp set that is newer. I got it last year and I haven't even used it yet. It is this Hero Arts stamps, and I promise I'll use that in another video. But it has a little bobble chain. So I'm going to align the Stamp and Died ornaments how I want them on my card. And then I'm going to put this bobble chain in my Misty and stamp it 3 times, 1 for each of the ornaments. Now, getting it lined up was a little tricky for a couple of reasons. I haven't stuck the ornaments down yet because I want the chain to come up from behind. The chain is a very thin, long stamp, so it doesn't necessarily want to lay straight. And you'll notice that a couple of these bobble chains, they're not straight. And I'm 100% okay with it, because if there was any kind of air movement, the ornaments would be moving on the tree, right? So once I have that lined up for the first ornament, I'm going to add a little more of that anti-static powder. I'm using the Rabbit Hole Designs tool, and I'm going to ink up that chain again and stamp it in the same silver embossing powder that I used for the ornaments. I'm using very light pressure with my fingertips to make sure that I don't squish out the little circles that make that bobble chain. And once I have it stamped and I'm liking how it's turning out, I will go ahead and add the embossing powder. And this is why I needed to let that panel dry, because if that ink was still wet, the embossing powder would have stuck to that ink that I had blended the edges in. So now that I have all 3 of those bobble chains stamped and heat set, I'm going to go ahead and clean off the card panel again. I'm just removing all of that anti-static powder from the powder tool that I used. And now it's time to kind of start putting things together. I want to put this card panel onto my card base first. I'm going to do that with foam tape, 3M foam tape. Sorry, my words are kind of weird. My throat is dry, and I'm trying to not cough all over you, and sorry, it's just weird. Anyway, once I got 3M foam tape all over the back of that card panel, I pulled in the card base, and I'm just going to eyeball center that onto the card base, just so that there's about the same margin all the way around. And eyeballing it works for me. And then I'm going to adhere the baubles, the ornaments, onto the card base, or the card panel, now card base. I'm going to use Tombow Mono glue. I thought about popping them up again, but that might be a little bit too much dimension to go through the regular mail. So I'm going to add some liquid glue to the back of the die cut. I'm going to hold it in place for a few seconds until it grabs, clean up the little piece that came out from behind it, and I'm going to set a stamping block on top of that while I move on to the next little ornament, just to kind of hold it in place. So I'm going to repeat the same process for the next 2 ornaments as well, just adding the glue, lining them up, and putting them in place. I think that this one is supposed to be the top ornament, and I forgot that it kind of overlaps the bottom one a little bit, so I had to put that aside and grab the one that's the roundish one that's meant to be down at the bottom. Or by meant to be, I mean that's how I did it in my head. So the one that was in my head supposed to be down here. And I am doing it that way because when I went to stamp the little chain for this taller bauble, it was really hard to get it in place, and I'm not sure that they don't overlap a little bit. So there's very little of that bauble chain that you can see hanging down, the ornament chain hanging down. It is now time to add a sentiment. I have this Mary die. This is a Honeybee Stamps die, and I have die cut it from a silver foil paper that I picked up at Joann's a gazillion years ago, like last spring. Oh heck, it might even have been last Christmas. I can't remember. A gazillion years ago. And I die cut the word Mary out of this silver paper. It's kind of a silver holographic. It's very shiny and pretty, and I love it. And I'm going to add Mary to the front of the card, right over the top of the ornaments or the baubles, depending on where you're from and what you call them. And I will hold that in place. And then I've also stamped And I did this stamping off camera because it was itty bitty and you couldn't really see it that well, and because my head was in the way. So, you know, you don't need to see my top knot. I stamped the word Christmas on top or on some white paper in black ink, and then I'm going to add the paper to the inside of the card where I can stamp or write a Christmas message to whichever one of my 100 people get this Christmas card. If you're struggling to get the card base open, just ignore that part. Pretend that's normal. Pretend that everybody in the world doesn't know how to open a card. And there we go. The card is finished. I'm so glad you stopped by today. I hope you enjoyed watching this process. I am super excited to be starting on my Christmas cards already because, like I've mentioned before, I send out a ton. I have a couple of other videos here I think you might like. I've also added that subscribe button. Go ahead and click that subscribe button. Also, give me a thumbs up if you like it. Tell YouTube you like it, and leave me a comment down below. I like to hear from you. Have a really great day.